The burgundy wine splashed across the white tablecloth as my grandfather Harold slammed his fist down, making every glass tremble. I dropped my fork staring at this man who was supposed to be dead for 3 years. His weathered face was flushed with rage as he pointed at a complete stranger sitting calmly beside our Christmas tree. Why is a stranger controlling the multi-million-dollar company I left you? His voice boomed through our dining room like thunder. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. What are you talking about? I don't even have $1 to my name. The room went silent. My parents and brother turned pale. Then the police arrived. The front door burst open before anyone could move. 3 uniformed officers stepped inside their heavy boots, echoing against our hardwood floors. Behind them walked a tall man in a crisp navy suit who surveyed our shocked faces with calculating eyes. "Nobody move," the stranger beside our Christmas tree said, quietly rising from his chair. He pulled out a badge that glinted under our crystal chandelier. Detective Marcus Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation. My mind reeled as I tried to process what was happening. Grandfather Harold stood at the head of our dining table, alive and breathing, when I had sobbed over his coffin 3 years ago. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his expensive charcoal suit immaculate. This was no ghost. Ernestine, sweetheart. Harold said, his voice gentling as he looked at me. "I know this is confusing, but I need you to listen carefully." My mother, Martha, clutched her pearl necklace, her knuckles white. My father, Robert, had gone completely rigid in his chair, his usually confident demeanor crumbling. My brother David pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane," David muttered, running his hands through his dark hair. "You're supposed to be dead." Harold's expression hardened when he looked at David. "I faked my death because I discovered someone was stealing from my company, someone I trusted completely." The memory of Harold's funeral flooded back. I remembered standing in the rain at Greenwood Cemetery, tears streaming down my face as I watched them lower his casket into the ground. I had been his favorite granddaughter, or so I thought. We used to spend hours in his study while he taught me about ships and cargo routes. He always promised I would understand the family business someday. "The funeral," I whispered. "I saw you buried." "An empty casket," Harold replied sadly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that grief, Ernestine, but I needed everyone to believe I was gone so I could investigate what was happening to my shipping empire." Detective Webb moved closer to our table, his eyes scanning each family member. "Mr. Harold Richardson hired private investigators 18 months ago when he discovered irregularities in his corporate accounts. What he found was systematic embezzlement on a massive scale. My Aunt Patricia and Uncle George, who'd been quietly eating their dinner, exchanged worried glances. Their twin daughters, my cousins Kelly and Amanda, looked confused and frightened. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely audible. "What does this have to do with me?" Harold reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a thick envelope. "According to my will, you were supposed to inherit controlling interest in Richardson Shipping, 51% of a company worth $800 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. I worked 2 part-time jobs just to afford my tiny studio apartment. My student loans were crushing me. Last month, I had eaten ramen noodles for dinner 12 nights in a row because I couldn't afford groceries. "That's impossible," I stammered. "I never received anything. After your funeral, the lawyers said everything went to Mom, Dad, and David." Detective Webb opened a leather portfolio and spread documents across our dining table. "These are photocopies of the original will filed with the county clerk 3 months before your grandfather's supposed death. You can see your name clearly listed as the primary beneficiary." I leaned forward to read the papers, my hands shaking. There it was in black ink. "To my beloved granddaughter, Ernestine Richardson. I leave controlling interest in Richardson Shipping along with all associated assets, properties, and accounts." "But I never saw this," I said, looking up at my parents. "Mom, Dad, you told me grandfather left me nothing because I wasn't responsible enough." Martha's face had gone ashen. She pressed her lips together tightly, refusing to meet my eyes. Robert cleared his throat nervously, his usual commanding presence completely absent. "There must be some mistake," Robert said weakly. "The lawyers handled everything. We followed their instructions exactly." Detective Webb's expression was grim. "Mr. Richardson, we have evidence suggesting you and your family participated in deliberate fraud to divert Miss Richardson's inheritance." David suddenly stood up his chair, falling backward with a crash. "This is ridiculous. Ernestine doesn't know anything about running a business. She can barely manage her own finances." "That's exactly why I included provisions for business training," Harold said quietly. "She was supposed to work alongside me for 5 years, learning every aspect of the shipping industry. Instead, I've watched her struggle in poverty while you 3 have been living like royalty." The truth of his words stung. Over the past 3 years, my family's lifestyle had dramatically improved. They moved from their modest suburban home to this sprawling colonial mansion. David drove a brand new BMW, and my parents had taken expensive vacations to Europe and the Caribbean. When I asked about their sudden wealth, they claimed Robert's consulting business was thriving. "I hired Detective Webb to go undercover," Harold continued. "For the past 6 months, he's been documenting evidence of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Tonight was supposed to be his final surveillance before we contacted the authorities." Webb nodded grimly. "What we discovered goes far beyond simple inheritance theft. This is organized financial crime involving multiple conspirators and millions of dollars." The police officers moved to strategic positions around our dining room. One stationed himself near the front door, another by the kitchen entrance. The third officer began taking notes as he observed our family's reactions. "Ernestine," Harold said softly, "I need you to know that every financial struggle you've endured for the past 3 years was unnecessary. Your inheritance included not just company shares, but also a trust fund worth $12 million. Money that should have paid for your education, your living expenses, and your future. $12 million. The amount was incomprehensible. I thought about all the nights I had worked late shifts at the coffee shop, coming home exhausted and discouraged. I remembered crying in my car after being rejected for yet another loan to cover my medical bills when I broke my wrist last year. "Where's that money now?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Detective Webb consulted his notes. "Transferred to accounts controlled by your parents and brother through forged legal documents and fraudulent power of attorney paperwork." The dining room fell into stunned silence. The only sounds were the ticking of our grandfather clock and the distant hum of Christmas music playing softly from the kitchen radio. Uncle George finally spoke up, his voice strained. "Harold, we had no idea about any of this. Patricia and I thought everything was handled legally through the estate lawyers." "I know, George," Harold replied. "This investigation has revealed exactly who was involved and who was innocent. That's why you and Patricia weren't contacted about tonight's operation." Kelly and Amanda, my 19-year-old cousins, looked bewildered. They had been away at college when Harold supposedly died and knew nothing about inheritance details. "Detective Webb will explain the criminal charges being filed," Harold said, settling heavily into his chair. The emotional toll of this confrontation was clearly exhausting him. "But first, I need Ernestine to understand how this deception was carried out." I stared at my parents and David, searching their faces for some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. Instead, I saw guilt, fear, and desperation in their eyes. The grandfather I had mourned for 3 years was alive, sitting across from me, revealing that my own family had stolen my future. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my struggles, and my place in the family had been built on lies. Detective Webb cleared his throat. "Miss Richardson, are you prepared to hear the details of how your inheritance was stolen?" Detective Webb opened another folder and spread a timeline of documents across our mahogany table. Each paper was marked with official seals and dates, creating a chronological map of deception that made my stomach turn. The fraud began 2 weeks after your grandfather's funeral. Webb explained, his finger tracing the timeline. Your parents and brother met with attorney Ronald Blackwood, who has since been disbarred for his involvement in this scheme. He handed me a photograph of legal documents. These are the forged papers that transferred your inheritance to your family members. Notice the signatures purporting to be yours, witnessed by individuals who claim they never saw you sign anything. I studied the documents with growing horror. Someone had practiced my signature, repeatedly creating a forgery that looked convincingly like my handwriting. The dates on these papers corresponded to times when I was working double shifts at the coffee shop, completely unaware that my financial future was being stolen. The original will was replaced in the county records. Webb continued. Your parents presented themselves as grieving family members handling estate details, and the clerk's office processed the paperwork without additional verification. Martha finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Ernestine, we thought we were protecting you. You were so young, so unprepared for that kind of responsibility. Protecting me. I stared at my mother in disbelief. By letting me live in poverty while you spent my inheritance. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The money was supposed to be temporary. We planned to give it back once you were more mature, more capable of handling wealth responsibly. Dad, I'm 28 years old. I said, my voice rising. When exactly was I going to become mature enough when I was 40, 50? David crossed his arms defensively. You have to admit, Ernestine, you've never shown any interest in business. You studied liberal arts in college. You work in a coffee shop. What would you have done with $800 million? The condescension in his voice was infuriating, but Detective Webb's evidence was even more damning. He showed me bank statements revealing the elaborate money trail my family had created. Your trust fund was liquidated in increments over 18 months, Webb explained. The money was transferred to multiple accounts controlled by different family members to avoid detection by federal banking regulations. Harold leaned forward, his face grim. Show her the receipts, Detective. Webb produced a stack of credit card statements and purchase records. Your family's spending pattern changed dramatically after the inheritance theft. In the past 3 years, they've purchased this house for $2.4 million, 3 luxury vehicles totaling $400,000, and taken vacations costing over $300,000. Each receipt felt like a slap in the face. While I had been eating generic cereal for dinner and walking to work because I couldn't afford bus fare, my family had been living like millionaires on my stolen inheritance. The house renovations alone cost $600,000. Webb continued gesturing around our elegant dining room. Custom Italian marble in the foyer, imported French fixtures in the bathrooms, a wine cellar worth $80,000. I remembered helping my parents move into this house, believing their story about Robert's consulting business booming. They had graciously allowed me to store some belongings in their basement, making me feel grateful for their generosity. Now I realized I was storing my possessions in a house purchased with my own stolen money. What about Richardson Shipping? I asked Harold. What happened to your company? Harold's expression darkened. That's where the situation becomes even more serious. David convinced the board of directors that he should assume temporary control while the estate was being settled. David's face flushed red. I saved the company from bankruptcy. Without my leadership, Richardson Shipping would have collapsed. Your leadership. Harold's voice was cold. Detective, show her what David's leadership accomplished. Webb presented corporate financial statements that made my blood run cold. Under your brother's management, the company has lost 60% of its major contracts. Annual revenue dropped from $500 million to $200 million. The documents showed a pattern of mismanagement that bordered on sabotage. David had fired experienced employees, canceled profitable shipping routes, and made decisions that systematically weakened the company's competitive position. But that's not the worst part, Harold continued. Tell her about the asset sales, Detective. Webb's next revelation made me feel physically sick. Your brother has been liquidating company assets without board approval. He sold 3 cargo ships, 2 warehouses, and exclusive contracts with major automotive manufacturers. The money from those sales, Harold said quietly, was transferred to offshore accounts controlled by your father. I turned to Robert, who was staring down at his untouched dinner plate. Dad, is this true? Robert's silence was answer enough. The man I had always respected as a successful businessman had participated in destroying his own father-in-law's legacy while stealing his daughter's inheritance. The offshore accounts currently contain $47 million, Webb continued. Money that should have been reinvested in company operations or distributed to shareholders according to corporate bylaws. Patricia and George looked stunned by these revelations. They had received modest inheritances from Harold's will and had no idea about the massive fraud being perpetrated by their relatives. Harold, Patricia said quietly, we received the money you left us, but we had no idea about Ernestine's inheritance. If we had known, we would have questioned the arrangements. I believe you, Patricia, Harold replied. That's why you and George aren't facing criminal charges. Detective Webb consulted his notes again. The federal investigation has identified additional crimes beyond the inheritance theft: tax evasion, money laundering, securities fraud, and violation of maritime shipping regulations. Harold looked directly at me, his eyes filled with pain and regret. Ernestine, for 3 years I've watched you struggle while your family lived in luxury purchased with your money. I've seen you work multiple jobs, take out loans for medical expenses, and worry about paying rent, all while sitting on evidence that could have restored your inheritance immediately. Why didn't you contact me sooner? I asked, my voice breaking. I needed ironclad proof that would hold up in federal court, Harold explained. If I had confronted them too early, they could have hidden the evidence and claimed innocence. Detective Webb needed time to document every transaction, every forged document, every illegal transfer. Webb nodded. The investigation required 18 months of careful surveillance and financial analysis. We now have enough evidence to secure convictions on multiple federal felony charges. The police officers began moving closer to my family members. One of them spoke quietly into his radio, apparently coordinating with additional law enforcement personnel outside. What happens now? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Your parents and brother will be arrested tonight, Webb replied. The federal prosecutor has already filed charges of inheritance fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and racketeering. David suddenly bolted toward the kitchen door, but the officer stationed there blocked his path effortlessly. Sir, please return to your seat. You're only making this worse for yourself. This is entrapment. David shouted, his composure completely shattered. You can't prove we intended to steal anything permanently. Detective Webb smiled grimly. Actually, we can. We have recorded conversations where you and your parents discussed keeping Ernestine uninformed indefinitely. We also have documentation of your plans to declare Richardson Shipping bankrupt to hide the stolen assets. The word bankrupt hit me like a thunderbolt. David hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He was planning to destroy Harold's life work to cover up his crimes. The bankruptcy filing was scheduled for next month, Webb continued. It would have eliminated any paper trail connecting the stolen assets to your inheritance. Harold's hands were trembling with rage and exhaustion. 60 years I built that company, 60 years of honest work, fair treatment of employees, and building relationships with clients around the world, and you were going to destroy it all to hide your theft. Martha finally broke down, tears streaming down her face. We never meant for it to go this far. We thought we were buying time, waiting for the right moment to explain everything to Ernestine. When, I demanded, when exactly were you planning to tell me you stole my inheritance and spent my trust fund? No one answered because there was no answer. They had never planned to return my money or reveal their deception. They had intended to let me struggle in poverty forever while they enjoyed the lifestyle my inheritance provided. Detective Webb closed his folders and stood up. Miss Richardson, I need to inform you that as the rightful heir to the Richardson estate, you're now considered the primary victim in this federal fraud case. The government will work to recover your stolen assets and restore your inheritance. Recovery of stolen assets, restoration of inheritance. The words sounded surreal after 3 years of believing I had nothing and no one to depend on except myself. But as I looked around our Christmas dinner table, now covered with evidence of my family's betrayal, I realized that recovering money would be the easy part. Learning to trust anyone ever again would be infinitely more difficult. Detective Webb signaled to the officers who began positioning themselves behind my family members. But before anyone could be arrested, Harold raised his hand. "Detective, there's more she needs to know." Harold said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "The Richardson shipping situation is worse than we've discussed." Webb nodded grimly and opened yet another file folder. "Your grandfather is right, Miss Richardson. The corporate fraud extends far beyond asset sales." Harold pulled out a stack of shipping contracts and spread them across the table. Ernestine Richardson Shipping has exclusive agreements to transport goods for 15 major American manufacturers. These contracts represent generational relationships built over decades. He pointed to specific documents marked with red ink. "Your brother has been systematically canceling these contracts and selling the business to our foreign competitors." David's face went pale, but he remained defiant. The company needed to modernize. Those old contracts weren't profitable anymore. Not profitable. Harold's voice was incredulous. These contracts generated $300 million in annual revenue. They were the foundation of our entire business model. Detective Webb presented a new set of documents. Mr. David Richardson has signed agreements to transfer Richardson Shipping's client base to Yangtze Maritime Corporation, a Chinese shipping conglomerate. The implications hit me immediately. "David, you're selling our family's American shipping company to foreign competitors. It's called Global Commerce Ernestine," David replied dismissively. "Something you wouldn't understand from your perspective serving coffee to college students." Harold slammed his hand on the table again, making the wine glasses rattle. "That Chinese company is owned by the same government that's been trying to dominate American shipping routes for the past decade. You're not just betraying our family, David. You're betraying American workers and American trade interests." Webb consulted his notes. "The sale agreement includes transfer of all shipping routes, client relationships, and proprietary logistics software developed by Richardson Shipping over 30 years. The logistics software alone is worth $50 million, Harold added. It contains routing algorithms, client preference data, and operational strategies that took our engineering team 15 years to develop. I stared at David in horror. "You're selling our trade secrets to foreign competitors." "I'm maximizing the value of a failing business," David shot back. "Richardson Shipping was hemorrhaging money. At least this way we recover something instead of losing everything." Detective Webb shook his head. "Actually, Mr. Richardson, our financial analysis shows the company was highly profitable until you assumed control. The losses began immediately after you started making operational changes." Harold pulled out employee records that made my heart sink. David fired 40% of our workforce in the past 2 years. These were people who had worked for Richardson Shipping for decades, people with families, mortgages, and children in college. The personnel files showed a systematic dismantling of our company's human resources. Experienced ship captains, logistics coordinators, and customer service representatives had been replaced with temporary contractors who lacked institutional knowledge and client relationships. Our employee pension fund was also liquidated. Harold continued, his voice breaking. 230 families lost their retirement savings because David claimed the company couldn't afford to maintain the pension obligations. Detective Webb presented bank records showing where the pension money had gone. The liquidated pension funds were transferred to the same offshore accounts, containing proceeds from asset sales. I felt physically sick. "David, you stole our employees' retirement money." "I made difficult business decisions," David replied coldly. Decisions that weak leadership like Harold's could never make. Harold's face flushed with anger, but his voice remained controlled. Those employees trusted our family for generations. Their fathers and grandfathers worked for Richardson Shipping. We promised them secure retirement, and you stole it to fund your criminal conspiracy. Webb turned to a new section of evidence. The federal investigation has also uncovered violations of international shipping law and environmental regulations. He presented shipping logs that documented illegal cargo manifests. Richardson Shipping has been transporting undeclared materials for Yangtze Maritime, including rare earth elements and manufacturing equipment subject to export restrictions. Harold's hands were shaking as he reviewed the shipping logs. David, these manifest violations could result in federal sanctions that would permanently ban Richardson Shipping from international commerce. The Chinese contracts were too profitable to ignore, David said defensively. American regulations are too restrictive for competitive global shipping. Detective Webb's expression was grim. Mr. Richardson, those regulations exist to prevent strategic materials from reaching foreign military programs. You've been unknowingly participating in potential national security violations. The scope of David's betrayal was overwhelming. He hadn't just stolen my inheritance and destroyed our family company. He had potentially compromised American trade security for personal profit. The Coast Guard has been monitoring Richardson shipping vessels for the past 6 months, Webb continued. 3 of your ships have been flagged for carrying prohibited materials without proper documentation. Harold buried his face in his hands. 60 years of building relationships with federal regulators, maintaining impeccable safety records, and earning trust as a reliable American shipping company. All destroyed. Robert finally spoke, his voice barely audible. We didn't know about the Chinese contracts or the shipping violations. David handled all operational decisions independently. But you knew about the money laundering, Webb replied. Bank records show you personally managed the offshore transfers of stolen assets. Robert's admission was devastating. Even if he hadn't known about the shipping violations, he had actively participated in hiding stolen money and destroying evidence of fraud. Patricia and George looked stunned by these revelations. Uncle George had worked briefly for Richardson Shipping in his 20s before starting his own accounting firm. Harold. George said quietly, I remember when Richardson Shipping employed over 800 people. The company was the largest private employer in the county. We're down to 150 employees now, Harold replied sadly. Most of them are scared they'll lose their jobs when the federal investigation concludes. Detective Webb presented employment records showing the human cost of David's mismanagement. Families who had depended on Richardson Shipping for decades now faced unemployment and financial uncertainty. The worst part, Harold continued, is that none of this was necessary. The company was profitable, growing, and positioned for expansion into new markets. David destroyed it deliberately to hide his theft of Ernestine's inheritance. The criminal conspiracy was becoming clear. David hadn't just stolen my money and mismanaged the company. He had systematically destroyed Richardson Shipping to eliminate any evidence of his fraud while selling our assets to foreign competitors for personal profit. Webb looked directly at me. Miss Richardson, as the rightful owner of controlling interest in Richardson Shipping, you need to understand that recovering your inheritance will require rebuilding a company that's been deliberately sabotaged. The responsibility was overwhelming. I had never run a business, managed employees, or navigated international shipping regulations. But hundreds of families depended on Richardson Shipping for their livelihoods and their futures now rested on my shoulders. Detective, I said, my voice stronger than I felt, what do I need to do to stop David from completing the sale to the Chinese company? Webb smiled for the first time that evening. That's exactly what we were hoping you'd ask. Detective Webb reached into his briefcase and pulled out a laptop computer, placing it carefully on our dining room table between the scattered legal documents and abandoned dinner plates. Miss Richardson, he said, opening the laptop and turning the screen toward me. What I'm about to show you might be the most shocking part of this entire investigation. The screen displayed a folder labeled Digital Evidence Collection, Richardson Case. Webb clicked on the first file, which opened to reveal a familiar image that made my stomach drop. "This is your Instagram post from last Christmas," Webb explained, pointing to a photo of me sitting in my tiny studio apartment. "You wrote Christmas dinner with my amazing family tonight. Grateful for another year of love and support." I remembered that post. I had felt so genuine gratitude despite my financial struggles, believing my family was supporting me emotionally, even if they couldn't help financially. Webb clicked to the next image showing my parents and David posting photos from that same evening. The contrast was stunning. While I was in my cramped apartment wearing a sweater from a thrift store, they were posting pictures from this mansion wearing expensive jewelry and designer clothing. Your social media activity over the past 3 years created an inadvertent timeline of evidence. Webb continued. Every post about your financial struggles, every comment about working multiple jobs, every photo of your modest living situation was time-stamped and geotagged. He scrolled through dozens of my posts, creating a digital diary of poverty, while my family's accounts showed increasing luxury and extravagance. "Here's where it becomes more interesting," Webb said, clicking on a new folder. "We've been monitoring your family's digital communications for the past 18 months. Harold leaned forward, his expression serious. "Ernestine, I hired Detective Webb because your letters to me before my supposed death mentioned strange things about our family's behavior." Webb nodded. "Your grandfather showed me letters where you questioned why your parents seemed to be avoiding conversations about his will. You mentioned feeling confused about being excluded from estate planning discussions." I remembered those letters clearly. I had been hurt and confused when my parents refused to let me participate in funeral arrangements or estate meetings. They claimed I was too emotional and needed to focus on my own life rather than complicated legal matters. "Your innocent questions created red flags," Webb continued. "When someone truly has nothing to hide, they don't work so hard to exclude family members from legal proceedings." He opened another file showing email exchanges between my parents and David. The messages were damning evidence of deliberate deception and planning. "This email from your mother to David dated 6 months after the funeral." Webb read aloud. "Martha writes, Ernestine asked again about inheritance details. We need to be more careful about maintaining the story that Harold left her nothing." Martha's face crumpled as her own words were read back to her. The casual way she had referred to maintaining the story revealed the calculated nature of their deception. Webb continued reading from the email chain. David responds, "Maybe we should set her up with someone who can provide financial stability. If she's married to the right person, she'll stop asking questions about money." The manipulation was breathtaking. They had actually discussed arranging my romantic life to keep me distracted from discovering their theft. "This next exchange is particularly revealing," Webb said, scrolling to a more recent message. "Your father writes to David, Ernestine's financial situation is getting desperate. She asked to borrow money for medical bills. Should we help her?" Robert had actually asked permission from his own son to help his daughter with emergency medical expenses. Webb read David's reply, "Absolutely not. If we start giving her money now, she might become suspicious about where our wealth came from. Let her struggle a little longer." The cruelty of those words hit me like a physical blow. While I had been lying awake at night worrying about medical debt that was damaging my credit score, my brother was deliberately blocking any assistance to preserve their criminal conspiracy. Harold reached across the table and took my hand. "Sweetheart, they discussed your financial struggles the way other people discuss the weather. It meant nothing to them." Webb opened another folder containing recorded phone conversations. "We obtained warrants to monitor your family's communications after discovering the initial evidence of fraud." He played an audio file that made my blood run cold. It was David's voice speaking to someone on the phone just 2 weeks earlier. "The problem is Ernestine." David's voice said through the laptop speakers. She's getting more persistent about family financial questions. Maybe it's time to consider more permanent solutions for keeping her quiet. More permanent solutions. The phrase sent chills down my spine. Webb paused the recording. This conversation was with a contact at Yangtze Maritime Corporation. Your brother was discussing ways to prevent you from discovering the inheritance theft and corporate sale. Harold's grip on my hand tightened. That's when I knew we couldn't wait any longer. David was escalating from theft to potential violence. Webb continued the recording. The voice on the other end had a slight accent and spoke in measured tones. American families can be complicated. Perhaps Miss Richardson would benefit from an extended overseas opportunity. We have positions available on shipping routes that require months at sea. You mean get her out of the country? David's voice asked. Permanently, the voice replied. The recording stopped leaving our dining room in stunned silence. David had been discussing arrangements to have me essentially kidnapped and taken overseas to prevent me from discovering the truth about my inheritance. Detective Webb's expression was grim. At that point, this investigation shifted from financial fraud to potential conspiracy to commit kidnapping and human trafficking. Patricia and George looked horrified. They had brought their daughters to Christmas dinner, not knowing they were witnessing the conclusion of a federal criminal investigation involving international conspiracies. The final piece of evidence, Webb said, opening one last file, came from an unexpected source. He showed me a screenshot of a text message conversation between Martha and a number I didn't recognize. Webb read the messages aloud. Unknown number package will be delivered tomorrow as discussed. Subject will be unconscious but unharmed during transport. Your mother replies, David says the timeline has moved up. Can you be ready tonight instead? Martha was sobbing now, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks. We never meant for it to go that far. David said it was just to keep her safe while we figured out how to fix everything. Fix everything. I stared at my mother in disbelief. By having me kidnapped, Robert finally spoke, his voice hollow. David convinced us that you were in danger because you were asking too many questions. He said temporary relocation was the only way to protect you from federal investigators who might try to use you as leverage. Detective Webb shook his head. Mr. Richardson, federal investigators don't kidnap potential witnesses. We protect them. Your son was planning to have your daughter disappeared to cover up his crimes. Harold stood up slowly, his face pale with exhaustion and emotion. Detective, I think we've heard enough evidence for tonight. Webb closed his laptop and gestured to the police officers. Mr. David Richardson, you're under arrest for inheritance fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. David lurched toward the patio door, but two officers were already moving to intercept him. This is all fabricated, he shouted. You can't prove any intent to harm Ernestine. Actually, Webb said calmly, we have 3 hours of recorded conversations where you discuss drugging your sister and arranging her transportation to a Chinese cargo vessel departing from Long Beach tonight. Tonight. They had planned to kidnap me tonight on Christmas Day after our family dinner. The recording device Webb carried had been documenting evidence of conspiracy to commit federal crimes in real time. As the officers placed handcuffs on David, he looked directly at me with an expression of pure hatred. You always were grandfather's favorite. You never deserved any of this. She deserved honesty, Harold said quietly. She deserved family who loved her more than money. Detective Webb turned to Robert and Martha. You're both under arrest as accessories to fraud and conspiracy. As my parents were handcuffed and read their rights, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything I had learned. My own family had spent 3 years stealing my inheritance, destroying our company, and planning to have me kidnapped to cover up their crimes. But what terrified me most was realizing how close they had come to succeeding. As the police officers escorted my family toward the front door, Detective Webb's radio crackled with urgent communication. He answered quickly, speaking in low, rapid phrases before turning back to Harold with a concerned expression. "We have a problem," Webb announced. "David's lawyers filed emergency injunctions this afternoon. All Richardson Shipping assets have been frozen pending a competency hearing for your grandfather and a fitness evaluation for Miss Richardson." Harold's face went ashen. "What kind of injunctions?" Webb consulted his phone, reading from legal documents that had been electronically filed. "David's legal team is claiming you suffered a psychological breakdown when you faked your death, rendering you mentally incompetent to make business decisions. They're also arguing that Ernestine is unfit to inherit corporate responsibility due to her lack of business experience and current financial instability." The implications hit me immediately. Even though David was being arrested for criminal fraud, his lawyers had created legal obstacles that could trap Richardson Shipping in bureaucratic limbo for months or years. "How is that possible?" I asked. "He's being arrested for stealing my inheritance." Webb shook his head grimly. "Civil law and criminal law operate on different timelines. The criminal charges will take months to prosecute, but the civil injunctions take effect immediately." Harold sank back into his chair, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen him. "This means the Chinese sale can proceed while we're tied up in court proceedings." Detective Webb's phone buzzed with another urgent message. He answered, listened briefly, then turned to us with increasingly bad news. "Harold, I just received word from the federal prosecutor. David's legal team has also filed complaints with the Securities and Exchange Commission, claiming Richardson Shipping has been operating without proper oversight since your supposed death 3 years ago." The legal web was becoming impossibly complex. Even though we had evidence of David's criminal activity, he had created enough legal confusion to potentially protect his corporate sale and theft. "There's more." Webb continued reading from his phone. "The Chinese shipping company has accelerated their purchase timeline. They're claiming that Richardson Shipping's legal troubles require immediate intervention to protect their investment and preserve jobs for American workers." Harold laughed bitterly. "Preserve American jobs, they plan to fire every American employee and move operations to Chinese ports." Webb nodded. "The sale documents we intercepted show exactly that. But legally, Yangtze Maritime is presenting themselves as rescuing a failing American company from family infighting and mismanagement." The front door burst open again and 3 people in expensive business suits strode into our dining room. The lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman in her 50s, surveyed the scene with calculating eyes. "I'm Catherine Steele, representing the emergency conservatorship petition for Richardson Shipping," she announced. "Mr. Harold Richardson, you're served with a court order requiring immediate psychological evaluation. Miss Ernestine Richardson, you're served with a competency assessment demand." She handed us official legal documents stamped with court seals. The papers required both Harold and me to undergo extensive psychological testing before we could participate in any business decisions regarding Richardson Shipping. "This is outrageous," Harold said, scanning the legal paperwork. "These are delay tactics designed to allow the corporate sale to proceed." Attorney Steele smiled coldly. "My client's position is that Richardson Shipping requires stable leadership during this crisis period. A man who faked his own death and a woman with no business experience are hardly qualified to manage an $800 million corporation." Webb stepped forward, showing his badge to the attorneys. "Ma'am, your clients are under arrest for federal fraud charges. These legal maneuvers constitute obstruction of a federal investigation." Detective Steele replied smoothly, "My clients have been charged, not convicted. Until criminal proceedings are concluded, they retain all legal rights to protect their business interests and family assets." I realized David's strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. By creating legal chaos around Richardson Shipping's ownership, he could argue that the Chinese sale was necessary to prevent total corporate collapse. Even from jail, he was manipulating the system to complete his theft. Harold's phone rang and he answered with a weary voice. After listening for several minutes, he hung up and turned to me with devastating news. "That was the Richardson Shipping Board of Directors," Harold said. They've called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. The Chinese company has threatened to withdraw their purchase offer if the ownership disputes aren't resolved immediately. Webb shook his head. The board doesn't understand that the Chinese purchase is part of the criminal conspiracy. They see it as the only option to save the company from legal chaos. Attorney Steele gathered her papers and prepared to leave. Mr. Richardson, Miss Richardson, you have 24 hours to complete your psychological evaluations. Failure to comply will result in automatic forfeiture of any claims to Richardson shipping ownership. After the attorneys left, our dining room felt like a battlefield. Harold and I were left with Detective Webb surrounded by evidence of criminal fraud, but legally powerless to stop the destruction of our family company. Detective, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, what are our options? Webb consulted his notes. The federal prosecutor is preparing emergency motions to freeze the Chinese sale, but corporate law is complex. Richardson Shipping is a publicly traded company with board responsibilities to shareholders. Harold stood up slowly, moving to the window that overlooked our neighbor's Christmas decorations. Colored lights twinkled cheerfully in stark contrast to the legal nightmare consuming our family. Ernestine, Harold said quietly, there's something else you need to know about Richardson Shipping's situation. I braced myself for more bad news. The company currently employs 640 families, Harold continued. If the Chinese sale goes through, they plan to immediately terminate all American employees and move operations overseas. The human cost was staggering. 640 families would lose their jobs, their health insurance, and their pension benefits right after Christmas. Webb received another phone call, speaking quietly before turning back to us with urgent information. Harold, the FBI has been monitoring communications between David's legal team and Yangtze Maritime. We have evidence that the accelerated sale timeline was coordinated with tonight's planned kidnapping of Ernestine. The conspiracy was even more elaborate than I had imagined. David hadn't just planned to have me kidnapped to hide his theft. He had timed it to coincide with legal maneuvers that would complete the destruction of Richardson Shipping. If Ernestine had disappeared tonight, Webb explained, the conservatorship petition would have proceeded unopposed. Harold would have been declared mentally incompetent. David would have been granted emergency corporate control from jail through his legal representatives, and the Chinese sale would have been completed within 48 hours. Harold's hands were shaking with rage and exhaustion. 60 years of building relationships, maintaining quality standards, and treating employees like family, all destroyed by my own grandson for money he was stealing from his sister. I felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities suddenly thrust upon me. In less than 24 hours, I needed to prove my competency to run a major corporation, navigate federal criminal proceedings, and find a way to save hundreds of jobs. But as I looked at Harold's defeated expression and thought about the families depending on Richardson Shipping, I realized I didn't have a choice. David had stolen my inheritance and tried to destroy our family legacy. Now it was time for me to fight back. Detective Webb, I said, my voice growing stronger. What do I need to do to stop this sale and save our company? Webb smiled for the second time that evening. Miss Richardson, that's exactly what we were hoping you'd ask. 3 days later, I stood in the boardroom of Richardson Shipping headquarters, surrounded by federal agents, corporate attorneys, and 15 board members who looked like they hadn't slept since our Christmas dinner confrontation. The psychological evaluations had been expedited, and both Harold and I had passed with flying colors, but David's legal team was still fighting our attempts to regain corporate control. Detective Webb had arranged for me to stay at a federal safe house after discovering additional evidence that David's criminal associates were planning to complete his kidnapping scheme even while he remained in jail. Ladies and gentlemen, Webb announced to the assembled board members, we have new evidence that directly impacts the proposed sale to Yangtze Maritime Corporation. Harold sat beside me, looking more alert than he had in weeks. The federal protection and medical care had helped him recover his strength, and his business instincts had sharpened as we prepared for this corporate battle. Webb activated a large monitor that displayed financial documents. Our investigation has discovered that Yangtze Maritime's purchase offer is funded by money stolen from Richardson Shipping itself. Board member Elizabeth Morgan, who had worked with Harold for over 20 years, leaned forward with interest. "Detective, please explain what you mean." Webb clicked to the next screen showing a complex money trail. The $47 million that David Richardson transferred to offshore accounts has been loaned back to Yangtze Maritime to finance their purchase of Richardson Shipping. The implications were staggering. David had stolen company assets, hidden them overseas, then arranged for those same stolen funds to be used by foreign buyers to purchase the company he had robbed. It's money laundering on an international scale, Webb continued. David Richardson is essentially selling Richardson Shipping to Chinese buyers using the company's own stolen money. Board member Thomas Chen, who had always been skeptical of David's leadership, shook his head in disgust. "So the Chinese aren't actually investing their own capital?" "Correct," Webb replied. "They're using David's stolen funds for the down payment, then planning to finance the remainder through loans secured by Richardson Shipping's own assets." Harold stood up, his voice clear and strong. "In other words, they're buying our company with our own money, then using our assets as collateral to pay themselves back. Richardson Shipping becomes responsible for financing its own destruction." Attorney Catherine Steele, representing David's interests, tried to interrupt. "These allegations are unproven and irrelevant to the immediate corporate governance crisis." Webb turned to her with a cold smile. "Ms. Steele, your client's jail cell is equipped with recording devices. We have 3 hours of conversations where David Richardson explicitly discusses using stolen company funds to finance the Chinese purchase." The monitor displayed transcripts of David's jailhouse phone calls. In his own words, he had described the money laundering scheme and bragged about his ability to profit from destroying our family business. Furthermore, Webb continued, David Richardson has been coordinating with associates to eliminate opposition to the corporate sale through intimidation and violence. The boardroom fell silent as Webb played an audio recording of David speaking to someone identified as Marcus Chen, a Yangtze Maritime representative. David's voice was clear through the speakers. "The old man and my sister are causing problems, but I have people who can handle persistent family members permanently." Marcus Chen's response was equally chilling. "American authorities ask fewer questions when problems are resolved overseas. We have shipping routes that pass through international waters where jurisdiction becomes unclear." Board member Elizabeth Morgan looked horrified. "Are they discussing murder?" Webb nodded grimly. "David Richardson and his associates have been planning to kill both Harold and Ernestine Richardson to eliminate opposition to the corporate sale and inheritance fraud." The recording continued with David providing specific details about Harold's medical conditions and my daily routines. He'd been gathering intelligence to help his associates plan our assassinations. Harold's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Detective, how imminent is this threat?" "We intercepted communications suggesting the murders were scheduled to coincide with the corporate sale completion," Webb replied. "Once the sale was finalized and the money transferred, you and Ernestine would have become loose ends that needed to be eliminated." Attorney Steele gathered her papers hastily. "I'm withdrawing my representation. This case has escalated beyond corporate law into international criminal conspiracy." As Steele left the boardroom, Webb addressed the remaining board members. "The federal government is seizing all assets associated with the proposed Chinese sale. Yangtze Maritime Corporation is under investigation for money laundering conspiracy to commit murder and violations of international shipping law." Board member Thomas Chen raised his hand. "Detective, what does this mean for Richardson Shipping's immediate operations?" "That depends on Miss Richardson," Webb replied, turning to me. I stood up, feeling the weight of responsibility for hundreds of employees and their families. 3 days of intensive consultation with Harold corporate attorneys and federal investigators had prepared me for this moment. "I'm formally assuming my position as majority shareholder and chief executive officer of Richardson Shipping," I announced. My first official action is to cancel all negotiations with Yangtze Maritime Corporation. The board members looked relieved, but I knew the real work was just beginning. My second action, I continued, is to initiate emergency financial recovery procedures to restore stolen assets and rebuild our operational capacity. Webb nodded approvingly. The federal government is prepared to assist with asset recovery and provide temporary financing to maintain operations during the criminal proceedings. Harold stood beside me, his pride evident despite the traumatic circumstances. Ernestine, tell them about the employee protection plan. I had spent hours developing strategies to protect our workforce during the company's legal and financial recovery. Effective immediately, I announced all Richardson Shipping employees will receive emergency financial assistance to cover health insurance premiums and basic living expenses while we stabilize operations. Board member Elizabeth Morgan smiled for the first time in days. How do we fund that assistance? The federal government has agreed to advance funds from the criminal asset seizure. Webb explained. Money stolen from Richardson Shipping will be used to protect Richardson Shipping employees. Harold added, Ernestine has also negotiated emergency contracts with 3 major shipping clients who remained loyal despite the recent chaos. The board meeting continued for several hours as we addressed operational details, employee communications, and federal coordination requirements. By the time we finished, Richardson Shipping had a clear path forward despite the criminal conspiracy that had nearly destroyed us. As board members filed out of the conference room, Webb approached me with final updates on the criminal investigation. David Richardson has agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Webb informed me. He's providing evidence about additional criminal associates and international money laundering networks. Harold shook his head sadly. Even now, he's only thinking about saving himself. What about my parents? I asked, dreading the answer. Webb's expression softened slightly. Martha and Robert Richardson are cooperating fully with the investigation. Their attorney has negotiated plea agreements that include restitution payments and community service rather than lengthy prison sentences. The relief was overwhelming. While I couldn't forgive their betrayal, I didn't want my parents to spend decades in federal prison. There's one more thing, Webb added. The federal prosecutor wants to discuss witness protection options for you and Harold. David's criminal associates remain active and international revenge targeting could continue for months. Harold and I exchanged glances. We had survived the immediate threat, but the consequences of David's criminal conspiracy would affect our lives indefinitely. Detective, I said, we appreciate the protection offer, but Richardson Shipping needs stable leadership. We can't run this company from hiding. Webb nodded approvingly. I expected you'd say that. We'll arrange for ongoing security consultation and regular threat assessment reviews. As we left Richardson Shipping headquarters that evening, Harold and I stood in the parking lot looking up at the building, where 3 generations of our family had built an honest business. Ernestine. Harold said quietly, I'm sorry you had to learn about leadership under these circumstances. I thought about everything that had happened since Christmas dinner 5 days earlier, my family's betrayal, David's criminal conspiracy, and the responsibility for hundreds of employees had forced me to grow up quickly. Grandfather, I replied, I'm sorry you had to watch your own family destroy what you spent a lifetime building. Harold smiled sadly. But we stopped them, didn't we? Richardson Shipping will survive, and the people who depend on us will keep their jobs and their dignity. As we drove home together, I realized that surviving my family's betrayal was only the beginning. Rebuilding Richardson Shipping and learning to trust again would take years of hard work and careful choices. But for the first time in my life, I had the resources and determination to face whatever challenges came next. 6 months after that life-changing Christmas dinner, I sat in my new office at Richardson Shipping headquarters, reviewing quarterly reports that showed our company was not just surviving, but thriving. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked the harbor where our cargo ships were loading containers bound for ports around the world. Harold knocked on my door and entered with his daily cup of coffee and the satisfied smile he wore whenever he reviewed our operational improvements. The federal prosecutor called. Harold announced, settling into the leather chair across from my desk. David's sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month. I looked up from the financial reports that showed Richardson Shipping had recovered 85% of our stolen assets. What's the recommended sentence? 15 years in federal prison, Harold replied. His cooperation with the international money laundering investigation reduced it from the original 25-year recommendation. David's plea agreement had exposed a network of corrupt shipping companies, offshore banks, and international criminal organizations. His information had led to dozens of arrests and the recovery of over $200 million in stolen assets from various victims. What about Marcus Chen and the Yangtze Maritime executives? I asked. Harold's expression was grim but satisfied. Arrested by Chinese authorities last month, it turns out their own government was investigating Yangtze Maritime for corruption and currency manipulation. David's evidence provided the final proof they needed. The international consequences of David's criminal conspiracy had reached far beyond our family business. Chinese authorities were using our case to crack down on corporate crime that had been damaging their legitimate shipping industry. My assistant knocked and entered with the day's employee communications. Miss Richardson, the quarterly staff meeting starts in 20 minutes. The entire workforce is gathering in the main conference hall. I straightened my blazer and gathered the reports that would show our employees how far Richardson Shipping had come since the Christmas crisis. 6 months ago, our workforce had faced unemployment and pension loss. Today, they were celebrating record profits and improved benefits. Harold and I walked together through the corporate headquarters that had been completely renovated during our recovery period. Federal asset seizure funds had allowed us to upgrade equipment, improve working conditions, and expand our fleet of cargo vessels. The main conference hall was packed with over 400 employees, from ship captains and logistics coordinators to administrative staff and maintenance crews. Their faces showed a mixture of pride and cautious optimism as I approached the podium. Good morning, everyone. I began looking out at families who had trusted Richardson Shipping with their livelihoods for generations. 6 months ago, we faced the greatest crisis in our company's history. Criminal fraud had stolen our assets, damaged our reputation, and threatened your jobs. The audience was completely silent, remembering the fear and uncertainty they had experienced during the federal investigation. Today, I'm proud to report that Richardson Shipping has not just recovered, but achieved record quarterly profits of $42 million, I announced. The conference hall erupted in applause and cheers. These employees had worked extra hours and accepted temporary pay cuts to help stabilize our operations during the legal proceedings. More importantly, I continued, we've restored full pension funding, implemented improved health insurance benefits, and established profit-sharing programs that ensure every employee benefits from our success. Harold stepped forward to address the workforce that had remained loyal through the most difficult period in company history. When I founded Richardson Shipping 40 years ago, Harold said, I promised that this company would always treat employees like family. That promise was broken by criminal fraud, but Ernestine has restored it with interest. The pension fund restoration had been my highest priority during our recovery. David's theft had endangered the retirement security of families who had worked for us for decades. I also want to announce our expansion plans, I added. Richardson Shipping has signed exclusive contracts with 12 new clients, which means we'll be hiring 200 additional employees over the next year. The applause was even louder this time. In an industry where companies frequently downsized or moved operations overseas, Richardson Shipping was expanding American operations and creating new jobs. After the employee meeting, Harold and I walked through the harbor where our cargo ships were loading containers for international delivery. The scene represented everything we had fought to preserve American workers, honest business practices, and relationships built on trust rather than corruption. Ernestine. Harold said, watching a crew load automotive parts bound for South America. "I need to tell you something I should have said months ago." I looked at my grandfather, who had become my closest advisor and friend during our company's recovery. "You've exceeded every expectation I had when I wrote your name in my will," Harold continued. "You've not just restored Richardson Shipping, you've made it better than I ever imagined possible." The compliment was especially meaningful because I knew Harold didn't offer praise lightly. 6 months of intensive business education, federal consultation, and operational management had transformed me from a coffee shop employee into a confident corporate executive. "Grandfather," I replied, "none of this would have been possible without your guidance and the loyalty of our employees." Harold smiled. "That's exactly the kind of leadership philosophy that will keep Richardson Shipping successful for the next 40 years. My phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Webb, who had become a close friend during the ongoing federal proceedings. "Great news," Webb's message read. "Martha and Robert's community service sentences were approved by the judge. They'll be working with financial fraud victim advocacy programs instead of serving prison time." My parents' cooperation with federal investigators had been complete and genuine. They had provided evidence testified against David's criminal associates and worked to make restitution to everyone affected by the fraud conspiracy. "Webb says Mom and Dad's sentencing went well," I told Harold, showing him the message. Harold nodded approvingly. "Martha and Robert made terrible choices, but they've accepted responsibility and worked to make things right. Our family relationships were slowly healing through honest communication and shared accountability. Martha had entered therapy to address the guilt and fear that had contributed to her poor decisions. Robert was using his financial expertise to help other fraud victims recover their stolen assets." My phone rang with a call from someone whose name made me smile, Jennifer Walsh, the CEO of Pacific Maritime Corporation, who'd become both a business partner and personal friend. "Ernestine." Jennifer's voice was excited. "I just received confirmation that Richardson Shipping has been selected for the International Shipping Excellence Award. You're going to be honored at next month's conference in Seattle." The industry recognition was validation that our company's recovery had been both financially successful and ethically exemplary. Richardson Shipping was being recognized as a model for corporate integrity and employee welfare. After ending the call, I looked around the harbor where Richardson Shipping vessels were preparing for departure to ports in 15 different countries. 6 months ago, our company had been nearly destroyed by family betrayal and criminal conspiracy. Today, we were stronger and more successful than ever before. Harold and I walked back toward the headquarters building, passing employees who waved and called out friendly greetings. The sense of community and shared purpose was exactly what Harold had envisioned when he started Richardson Shipping 4 decades earlier. "Ernestine," Harold said as we reached the building entrance, "I have one final surprise for you." He handed me a legal document with his signature and official corporate seals. "What is this?" I asked, scanning the official language. "Your formal appointment as chairman and CEO of Richardson Shipping," Harold replied. "I'm officially retiring and transferring all remaining authority to you." The moment was both thrilling and emotional. Harold had guided me through the most challenging period of our lives, but now he was confident in my ability to lead independently. "Are you sure you're ready to retire?" I asked. Harold chuckled. "Ernestine, watching you transform this company has been the greatest accomplishment of my career. I'm not retiring because I have to. I'm retiring because I want to see what you accomplish when you're completely in charge." As we entered the building together, I reflected on everything that had changed since that shocking Christmas dinner. David's criminal conspiracy had nearly destroyed our family and business, but surviving it had made us stronger and more united than ever before. The federal investigation was concluding the stolen assets had been recovered, and Richardson Shipping was thriving under new leadership. Most importantly, hundreds of families had secured jobs and bright futures because we had fought back against corruption and betrayal. Harold was right about one thing: the next 40 years of Richardson Shipping would be built on the foundation of integrity, employee welfare, and honest business practices that had sustained us through our greatest crisis. Standing in my office that overlooked the harbor where our ships carried American goods to markets around the world, I realized that discovering my family's betrayal had been painful, but ultimately liberating. I had learned to trust my own judgment, fight for what was right, and lead with both strength and compassion. The little girl who used to sit in Harold's study listening to stories about ships and cargo routes had grown into a woman capable of protecting the legacy he had built and the families who depended on our success. As Harold often reminded me, truth always emerges, integrity builds lasting success, and family means the people who stand with you when everything else falls apart. Richardson Shipping would continue to thrive because we had learned that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the trust and loyalty of people who believe in your character and share your values. What would you do if you discovered your own family had stolen your inheritance and tried to destroy everything you were meant to inherit? Have you ever had to fight back against people you trusted completely? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you believe that justice and integrity always triumph over greed and betrayal. Subscribe for more stories about families who overcome impossible challenges, and share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most devastating betrayals. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery, recovery, and triumph. May you always have the courage to fight for what's right, even when the people opposing you are the ones you love most.